Thank you for joining us today on the Secure Justice Podcast. We have a special guest from UC Berkeley, Brandie Nonnecke. If you want to download the full ridiculous 20-page CV online, go for it.
Ridiculous.
I'll just hit the highlights. I'll assume your parents were hard to please. Half those things I had to go look up and see what you've accomplished. But you're the founding director of the CITRIS Policy Lab, professor at Goldman School of Public Policy. You co-direct at the Berkeley Center for Law and Technology, which Secure Justice has done some work with, and co-director of the AI Policy Hub, which we're definitely going to get into today. You've also been named one of the 100 most brilliant women in AI. So congratulations.
Thank
you
you
for being here. Really appreciate this opportunity. So before we get into the specifics of what we want to talk about in AI, most of our audience is going to have some understanding of it, but many won't. Give us a simplified version. When we say AI, what are we talking about?
Yeah, I'm actually really happy that you have put this at the beginning of our conversation, because I've noticed that a lot of people, when they're talking about AI, artificial intelligence, they're often talking past each other. And they're not actually talking about the same thing. Now, of course, because ChatGPT has been this sort of marvel of machine learning that everybody's been able to get their hands on, I'm noticing that when we say AI, most people jump to thinking about Gen AI. But AI is on a continuum. There are many, many different types of AI, and I would actually prefer that we use the term machine learning. Now, machine learning is statistical pattern recognition. And we think of it along a continuum from weak AI all the way to strong AI. And when we're talking about weak AI, that's more like your statistics courses you took in your undergrad, where you learned about logistical regression, linear regression, finding patterns in the data. And we keep moving along to more advanced forms of machine learning. Now we have something called deep learning, which has been able to be developed because of our ability to access compute power and data. And that's what we use to develop some of those Gen AI tools today, like the large language models, ChatGPT. And so the continuum goes even further, all the way to what some would consider to be a sentient AI, where the AI itself is intelligent, an intelligent being. I personally believe we're nowhere near that.
I personally am grateful. That sounds scary. So we're way beyond the old school flip-phone predictive texting, which is really just rudimentary statistics. Now we're going, let's teach these machines, which are the rule sets that we built, but really to learn. To advance data.
Yeah, but they don't do that learning in isolation. Now, there are let me just outline some common forms of machine learning. Okay, so there's supervised machine learning. That's where we take a data set and we label it. So I say if something is round, it fits in the palm of my hand, it's a fruit, it's red, it has a stem, it's probably an apple, right?
Yeah.
Now, if I also hold in my hand something that is also a fruit, it's red, it's round, and it has a stem, but it's actually a tomato. Like that algorithm would maybe, if I didn't label my data correctly, saying that not all things that are red, round, and have a stem are an apple. There's these other things that look in this way. That's the form of supervised machine learning. Then in the advancement in the field, we went to unsupervised machine learning, where the model itself can identify what we call latent factors. So it might identify that it's actually the sheen on the apple that is a significant characteristic of an apple. And then now all the way to this reinforcement learning in the deep learning space. And that's why I'm going along this continuum. But even ChatGPT, the model, GPT-4, that model uses reinforcement learning via human feedback. So if anybody listening or watching has played with ChatGPT and you put in a prompt and you get a response and it wasn't quite right, and you either said do it again or you gave it a thumbs down, you're also training that model to teach it that actually the response you gave me in response to the prompt was inappropriate.
And so that's what we've been doing for these past years with like CAPTCHA and other little things, is we're helping, as we click on objects, we're helping them identify and give feedback.
Yeah, but definitely human beings are a significant part of the development of these models. And that's something that not a lot of people talk about. first, the initial development of the models. There is a lawsuit currently happening in Kenya against OpenAI because OpenAI outsourced the work to Kenya to train their model. So those individuals were looking for content that was harmful, dangerous, violent, and they would flag that content generated so that the model would no longer generate that content. However, they were significantly underpaid, and there was no mechanism in place for them to get any therapy or assistance.
Trauma.
Yes, it's very traumatic content, including like child sexual abuse material. So there is currently a lawsuit that OpenAI should have put in greater protections and should have compensated them in a more appropriate way.
Yeah, and I think this is an important point. Sometimes I see it in I'm more police side surveillance tech, but where AI is moving in. Vendors especially, but politicians like to think this is all very automated, super sciencey. There's really a lot of humans in the background still manually clicking, and obviously that'll change over time, but people need to be aware it is
There's
a
a true human cost
Yes.
to building these tools.
Yeah.
And not just those human costs of the people actually going in and retraining and coding and labeling, but also we have to talk about the environmental effects of some of these large models where they're using a lot of compute power, which uses a lot of energy, but also uses a lot of water to cool down the computers as they're going through these really intricate processes. And I think that's something that definitely needs more attention.
Yeah, that really caught me off guard when I read, I forget the publication the other day, but the author was suggesting if it already isn't more resource intensive than like Bitcoin mining, which has been creating a lot of problems, especially in China, like it soon will be, especially for folks like OpenAI.
Yeah, but there is some hope in that. There is some hope because there's been there's some people saying, look, the models are going to get more efficient. We're going to be able to do more with less data. We're going to get leaner and meaner. There's some potential there.
Right. And so you said large language model, LLM is the other acronym going around. What is that? Like, why are we hearing this in the news all the time?
Yeah, so an LLM, a large language model, generates, text. So essentially, ChatGPT learned from a large corpus of data scraped from the internet to predict what is the likely next word. So it just analyzed all of that. Some people say, it read all of that. I feel like that sort of anthropomorphizes the technology, but it just digested all of that information. It said, if I'm writing a poem about, the night before Christmas, it's probably going to sound a lot like The Night Before Christmas that we all know that poem, because it's learned that that's the style of the writing. And the interesting thing, though, is that we've moved now, LLMs have moved to LMMs, and those are large multimodal models. So GPT 4.5 is an LMM, meaning that you don't just use it to generate text, but you can use it to do text to video, text to static images. And so there's all these different new modalities in play.
I'm glad we're not publishing our IQs on this podcast because the stuff you guys are coming up with is amazing. Let's talk about what you're coming up with. At the AI Policy Hub at CITRIS, what tools are you creating to better understand and ensure we get the utility from AI? What are you training, future students and regulators to do? What are you guys learning out there?
Yeah, it's really important for us to cut through the hype around the technology. And AI is significantly hyped, especially Gen AI, And these discussions on both sides of the hype cycle, either this utopian narrative that this transformative technology will allow society to finally be able to overcome any of its failings, like climate change, all the way to this dystopian narrative of robots replacing workers and the death of creativity. We can't have discussions on the fringe. There's nothing productive about that. Yeah. So what we do, we have a show called Tech Hype, which also we're sharing this through. And in our show Tech Hype, we debunk misunderstandings around emerging technologies, discuss the real benefits and risks, and explore what are those technical and policy strategies we can implement that will enable both the technology to flourish and grow and innovate, but also do it in a way that benefits society.
I've personally benefited from tech hype, so thank you. The demystifying part, especially to a non-technologist that then goes and sticks his nose into policy writing on these technologies I have no experience with. I do appreciate that. When legislators get ideas about regulating, I think always, no matter what the topic is, the people subject to them are going to get freaked out. Tech, of course, is going to be very profit motivated, as you would expect. If we didn't miss any bills, my board, we just went through all the AI bills that were introduced in California for this session, and there's about 21, 22. Some are, just little word cleanups, but there's a good dozen that you can tell these assembly members and senators are really trying to make a name for themselves. And out of all the different electeds, there's maybe two that I know what they're doing, that have done this in the past and have some expertise. So are state and federal folks coming to you and your colleagues? I know we have a lot of smart people at Berkeley, but saying like, we need the technical expertise before we go pretend we know how to regulate this stuff.
Exactly, and it's not just a technical issue, it's a socio-technical issue. And so I have them coming to us to say, is there anybody in your network who can talk about what are the social impacts, the economic impacts, environmental impacts, and then how might we think about the technology and how it should be regulated so that we can better ensure that all of those groups are going to be protected and that we're thinking through all of the different parameters of this technology. So yes, definitely we work very closely with members of the California legislature and Congress, and the work, I think it's moving along. Now this idea that regulation stifles innovation and this knee-jerk reaction from industry to push back, I think in large part, first, that's a trope that is often untrue. Some of the most highly regulated sectors are also the most innovative. For example, the clean energy sector. There's lots of innovation, lots of growth. So instead of thinking about regulation as stifling innovation, I think it's better to think about regulation creating an equal playing field for firms to be able to operate. It's not that these AI technologies operate in isolation from established laws, right? Nobody cares if you're using an AI-enabled HR tool versus not. If it's discriminatory, then you will be punished on the grounds of not adhering to equal employment opportunities. It's instead of providing recourse for a wrong after it's happened, instead some of these bills are trying to actually mitigate the harm before it happens for people.
And you're preaching to the choir on that one, because in my world, law enforcement, police, it's throw it out in the wild. Who cares if facial recognition has a 35% error rate? It's just a tool, and we'll do it the proper way. Constitutionally, we promise. We're always on our good behavior. I've been told by so many of my mentors, or had this concept drilled into my head: privacy by design, privacy by design. Mm-hmm. But none of the activists I work with are willing to talk to the vendors. It's just the optics don't look good. I'm one of the few folks that goes and gets into the weeds with these people. Are you having success when you're facing, a ridiculous profit motive? The amounts of money being made are so huge. Are they listening, or is it whitewashing that we've seen with a lot of ethics boards and so forth?
Yeah, I think it's also about us sort of understanding what our carrots and sticks are with these groups. So I was almost already going to say vendors, because I'm going to say procurement is the biggest stick that we can beat them with.
Yeah.
They need us more than we need them, right? They have to sell their product.
Yeah.
Right now, we're having many conversations with some of the large generative AI developers on how the university, how UC Berkeley is going to be able to adopt this technology in a way that's safe, secure, and upholds the privacy rights of all of the individuals affiliated with the University of California. And I'm really, really proud of the work that they've been doing to push back and ask those tough questions. So I would say, we actually have more power than we think to push them. Second, most of those companies signed on to the voluntary AI commitments that were issued by the White House last year. I say, you know what, they signed on to that, put their feet to the fire and say, look, you said that you were going to give transparency reports on the limitations of your technology, any of the potential risks. We want to see it before we procure your technology.
I'm I can tell that I'm gonna start bothering you too much with future requests for help, because that is where I built my career, is more at the municipal level, but on procurement. And like, you want our money, play by our rules.
Yeah.
And in some areas that is really starting to work. There was a really big victory, and just, I'm gonna call it a simple technical fix, maybe it wasn't, but in the civil liberties world, we had a real big concern with geofence warrants, where you would just submit this very broad request, for 6 hours on a Saturday in this geographic area, and Google would just hoover up all this data and send it to you. And after sustained advocacy, Google turned off that switch.
Right.
And just right then, we didn't even need a legislative change. It just doesn't technically work that way anymore.
Yeah, I mean, there's the naming and the shaming.
Right.
There are different policy levers we can pull. When we're trying to influence tech policy. When I say tech policy, I don't mean like policy with a capital boldface P. It can be soft, like soft governance strategies, put pressure on them.
Yeah.
And I think that some of the companies, we are their consumers, we can put that pressure on them. Now, I'm not naive to know that there are only a few big players in the space. If you want to use ChatGPT, that's what you're going
Right.
to do. And then also, of course, we have these enterprise vendor agreements where without us necessarily having the free will to choose, we will be locked in to
Right.
using certain tools. But we do have some power, I think.
Yeah. Before we can get to regulation, we have to understand what the problem is. And what I've seen from the outside of your industry is a lack of consensus. How do we even test for bias? What is bias? I've seen
Yeah.
75 different definitions. Nobody agrees on a standard. Oh, NIST will figure it out in 10 years, and we'll just rely on this fake artificial lab creation testing to, have
Right.
real world results. Is there any traction going towards a consensus? Are we getting better testing models, I guess, to address some of these known problems?
Yes, and I would say, look, the field is not that new. I mean, AI has been around since the 1950s, 1960s, and it really ramped up. There's been some lulls in that development, and now with our, as I was saying before, increased compute power and access to data, we've been able to make significant advancements. Now, these newer models, some of them called deep learning, that use neural nets, almost like how our brain fires, using these multiple layers to make decisions, those can be harder to audit. But there is work that's happening in this space. For example, using something called counterfactuals to audit those systems to see if I change one thing, does it change the outcome? And can you see over time, kind of brute force testing,
Yeah.
what's changing? And then that might give you some insight into whether or not it's making a decision based off of a protected characteristic in a way that it shouldn't. And then the field, it's not old, but it is new. At the same time, the idea of governing these technologies, and we're working really hard to think about how do we do this in an appropriate way. And I completely agree with you that when we talk about fairness, transparency, now security might be a little bit tighter because the security space has matured.
Yeah.
And the same thing is going to be happening in the AI governance space. Now, one thing that is really important for me that we discuss is that the space right now is very patchworked, where we have the European Union and their EU AI Act that will require conformity assessments, so essentially a risk assessment on an AI tool that will be deployed in the European market, especially in these high-risk areas like education, health, finance. Now, at the same time, in the United States, we don't have the same thing. We have the NIST AI Risk Management Framework, which is a voluntary framework. Even the implementation of those assessments, it's driven by industry. It's not that NIST or even the EU will say this is exactly how you implement it, but the vendors will implement and then they will give a report. So I have some worry about either the companies not doing a good enough job to actually assess all risks first, and then second, I think for some of these companies, it will be inefficient for them to have all of that talent in-house. And we're already seeing this. We're seeing these this burgeoning sector of third-party auditors, certifiers, licensors. How do we know that they're doing a good enough job? And they're not some fly-by-night group that you just slide some money over and they've audited your system and now it just works. It's
Right.
perfect.
It's the Wall Street rating agencies in 2008. Like, oh, these products are great. You know,
Oh yeah,
A-rated.
look where that got
Yeah,
us.
yeah.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
So there is some talk about actually licensing those third parties. And some of the standards bodies like IEEE, they're developing training on this. Like, what is fairness and non-discrimination? How do you actually implement this in practice? But even then, it's not easy.
Yeah. I'm really glad you brought up the sort of in-house expertise problem. Again, kind of my ongoing nightmare at the local level. We had these surveillance technology vetting frameworks kind of explode, following Snowden and just some other, good tailwinds that really let us make a lot of quick progress. And we got all these frameworks in place and nobody knew what we were talking about. Nobody knew what the problem was. Again, Mr. Non-Technologist, I might be in the room and be the most qualified person talking. That's not a good thing. On the one hand, my paranoid side was like, well, if you don't know what bad stuff you can do, then maybe it's okay. Like, you don't actually know how to harm us. But, I don't work on anything that's not mandated because I just don't think, a corporation with a profit motive is going to just voluntarily take on a lot of work. But what I'm also worried about, kind of like the rose-colored lens you get still when it's mandated. That's part of these local frameworks I work on. For example, the police department writes the impact analysis for facial recognition. And of course, it's always life-saving technology, no harm here, most wonderful thing in the world. And so I'm curious if you've seen a model in place anywhere in the world that is solving these different tensions and incentive misalignment problems. Could be an academic and a private party, hybrid almost, to try to educate people and regulate. Is that even happening, or maybe that's 2-3 years down the road?
Yeah, and actually I think that this idea that people don't understand the technology, we need to back up on that a little bit, because there are all sorts.
You do, I don't. So.
Well, I'm sure you do, actually. I'm sure that you do, and you're just not giving yourself enough credit. And that's part of playing into this narrative that we hear in the media and elsewhere, that this technology is so significantly advanced that we should be afraid, that it's sentient, that it can understand it's going to replace all human beings. I think, look, there's an incentive for the firms to hype the technology, that it's incredibly difficult to get funding from VCs. And then second, to hype it to this extent that it's so incredibly complicated that nobody could understand how it works. We don't even understand how it works, as they sometimes say. So there's no need for regulators to look here. In the work that we do, we try to teach everybody a working knowledge of what these tools are and their impact in your life. All of us use a computer every day. We use a smartphone every day. Do we really know how Wi-Fi works?
Not at all.
No. So, right?
Yeah.
We interact with these things all the time, but we know how, we get it. Right? So I think we need to give ourselves some more credit.
Okay. To push back on that, let's bring up, I learned this new term the other day, grokking. And I won't even bother to butcher explaining it, but basically, following statistical models, they expected a certain result, and this AI ended up learning something in a foreign language that it never should have been. It's like teaching math in a foreign language, or it was just something that shouldn't have happened. Mm-hmm. And they still don't understand where this came from. How do you regulate that? And the sub part of that is, if we decide that we must test before we put it in the real world, test for safety, wouldn't that kill innovation because there are unknowns?
I think it's not about mitigating all risks, but it's identifying those that are the most relevant and putting in place safeguards. And it's definitely not one and done. No firm should ever, especially if you're in a high risk area, do one risk assessment and then just unleash it into the world. That's not how it works. You have to do this continuous monitoring. So sometimes we call this algorithmic auditing and continuous monitoring. So you're always looking to see, is it performing spuriously? Is it making these weird connections that we could have never imagined? So, and then if it does, you go back, you take it and try to figure out what's going on here. How can we mitigate that? How can we put in some, tap in the brakes a little bit to see how we can fix this before it causes more damage.
Okay. I saw you posting quite a bit about Taylor Swift the deep fake porn images that are going on, or at least on Twitter. I don't know if that's what I saw they were being reported on Twitter. I think 8 of the bills introduced in California this year that pertain to AI, this space, have a watermark provision.
Right.
And, you know, we'll see how that kind of plays out depending on the different type of, you know, media that it's, you know, the watermark would be placed on. I get the utility of doing that. What I'm not confident of today is that really going to solve the problem? You know, does that dissuade somebody that wants to look at Taylor Swift in a fake porn because there's a watermark at the bottom? And because that gets kind of into another question I want to ask you about really the privacy invasiveness. What I've seen most of the sort of AI grumbling right now is from authors and copyright holders suing because their content's getting used and they're not getting compensated. Right. As a privacy activist, you know, I'm seeing more of, I just lost my anonymity and obscurity. You know, before nobody knew who I was. I could hide out in a big crowd. But now these guys, you know, the LLMs are taking up so much data that might kill privacy. So what is a watermark going to do?
This is such a good point. First, I think we should acknowledge that most of these applications of generative AI in pornographic ways are typically targeted at women. And just to say, even there are open source models, one of which was built at UC Berkeley called Pic-to-Pix. And that was used by somebody else to create a model that would predict what a woman would look like naked. You could take a picture of her in her clothing and then it would predict what she would look like. So this is not a new problem. Okay. So what do we do about it? There's a coalition called C2PA.org. It's the Coalition for Content Provenance and Authenticity, C2PA.org. Okay. And a lot of the big companies are involved in this, Adobe, Microsoft, Intel, a lot of them. Now what they're trying to do is to develop standards around what you're referring to as watermarks. I would be cautious to call them a watermark because they're not a traditional watermark like on the image itself. It's actually a cryptographic hash. So it's using cryptography on that file and it can't be removed. And the point of that is, and then anytime that content is uploaded anywhere, so it's uploaded to Instagram, X, wherever, they're gonna see that hash and they can do a few different things with it. They can then label it and say, this is an AI generated image. Take that knowledge with you as you consume it. Right. Number 2, they could put it into maybe a queue that says, this has this hash on it, we better check it, make sure, you know, not a politician is being displayed in this. We're already afraid that deepfakes are going to definitely affect the presidential election. Yeah. And then sort of do some vetting and verification before it goes viral. Okay, the other thing is, yes, even having those, the hash and identifying that content was AI generated, we're still gonna live in a world where people are going to claim that that's fake news. Yeah. That, the company's against me. They put that image on there to make sure that the people don't know the truth about my opponent. My opponent really did that. So another thing that people are doing, and the camera makers themselves are developing essentially the same thing to say, with this cryptography on the image of a video from even our iPhone or from some other camera, that this is real. This came from a real camera. So we'll have to see how this works. This area is just rife for research about how, like, does having the labeling even work? How are nefarious actors going to kind of twist this to, you know, achieve their own objectives?
Yeah, I would imagine at scale, that filtering would be really difficult. I mean, X's filters, I mean, half the people are saying it's Elon and a conspiracy, but I think it's mostly just, he laid everybody off. Yeah. He doesn't have anybody there to do the monitoring and trust and safety.
Well, we can automate some of the monitoring. Yeah. So, I mean, to get a little bit meta, I mean, we can use these machine learning models to look at the images. Right. But the other thing is, most content on the internet is manipulated, right? A lot of us on Instagram, you know, use a little filter here and there so that we look a little nicer.
Yeah.
And even our phones on our camera are doing a little bit of airbrushing.
I was just reading, I think it was DoorDash or Grubhub, like 80% of the photos already are AI generated. It's like 30% of them weren't even like real foods we have on the planet. You know, there's just weird shapes and things that came out. It's like, it's not even, it's like, oh yeah, I'll take that. It's like, it doesn't exist. But, you know, lower on the threat matrix there. I just watched Oppenheimer the other night, and I, you know, I was kind of thinking about the tension. You know, do we create the bomb? Do we drop the bomb? You know, is this deterrent thing we need? Is this, you know, bad for all of humanity, race to the bottom? And that's some of the hype and, you know, I think overblown concern about AI is that, you know, maybe we shouldn't just develop this at all. If these weird phenomena like grokking and whatever the heck else is out there. But I, as a guy that works on policy that tries to stop the release it out into the wild, we'll figure it out later mentality, you know, I can get compelled somewhat by sometimes you just gotta test it out in the real world. And I guess that's a concern, a question to, you know, a subject matter expert. Is the testing we have today sufficient? And let's just limit it to the high-risk areas, you said. Mm-hmm. Is it sufficient to where we can test it safely in this control lab, for lack of a better word, and go, you know what, I think this is a reasonable amount of risk, let's go do that. Yeah. Or is it, like, I mean, a lot of the things, it's just like, you know, it's a model and you just got to throw it out there and actually test it in the real world and refine it over time. It's just, we just can't solve that tension.
Yeah, well, first I would say in the absence of those models, we still have decisions that are being made oftentimes by humans who themselves are quite fallible, right?
Good point.
We have implicit bias.
Yes.
So actually a lot of people talk about these systems, and it really bothers me when they say that these systems create bias. They don't create bias. All they do is reflect the biases that are there in our society. And in my view, that's one of the greatest benefits, because we can't deny it anymore. It's there. You can see it in the data, you see it in the decision making, and now we need to do something about it. So it makes kind of black and white, something that people could just say, oh no, I'm not biased. So that to me is one benefit. Now, whether or not we can release these in a meaningful way, yeah, I think that we kind of have to. We're the cat's out of the bag. Now, we're on the Berkeley campus today, which was obviously Oppenheimer, the significance of this actual location, which I'm sure those people actually were here with the graduate. Yeah. But also with that, and thinking through the role of UC Berkeley, we are also leading the AI research. So yeah, you bringing this up is quite relevant, because we are the leaders in AI research. And I'm really proud to see that those individuals, even the extreme technical folks, are thinking about how to do this responsibly. What are the appropriate uses? You know, how can it be regulated in a meaningful way? And one of those people is Professor Stuart Russell, who literally wrote the book on artificial intelligence and has been a leading voice in helping to guide, you know, governance and regulatory efforts in both the public and private sector. So I'm hopeful that we'll be able to harness the technology in a way that will benefit us all.
Okay, let me push back on just one specific use, because I do think I would fall along the lines of the others. You know, let's say you get disapproved for a housing application, you got kicked out of a benefits program that you were qualified for because this algorithm just, you know, misidentified you, came up with the wrong risk score, whatever. There's less of a loss of liberty or life, or, you know, there's a faster, quicker, easier remedy. The stakes are lower. But like predictive policing, you know, I'm glad President Biden is paying attention to AI. I am 100% opposed to this huge push they're trying to move the locals into pursuing predictive policing analytics. And on that one, where we use historical data, and because kind of what you're saying earlier, like I hear from both the police and vendors a lot, is like, well, and you know, I'm in Oakland, police department's been under federal monitoring for 22 years because of racial bias. Racist policing practices. Like, well, Brian, if we just use the technology, it won't be racist. okay, maybe
No.
the license plate reader scan itself, just scanning a license plate going by, it doesn't know if you're black or white driving. But we're putting these into our case management system.
But I would guarantee that where the cameras
Even
are
where they're being placed
located,
is itself.
where they're being placed is
Yeah.
likely not in white collar neighborhoods.
Exactly, yes, that's another project I'm working on, is trying to get these folks to see, like, there's an entire surveillance ecosystem. Why is it just in East Oakland?
Yeah.
It's not in Montclair. But our historical data is gonna reflect that. We've only enforced certain crimes against certain demographics. We prosecute penalties at different amounts if you're black or you're white. How can we test that in the real world when it has to use historical data that we already know is dirty? That's the one I can't see us doing.
Yeah, I'm gonna say something like very provocative.
Okay.
Okay, could get me in trouble, I don't know, but we'll see. I think the fact that ChatGPT is coming for white collar jobs is actually getting those people in power to start paying attention. Before, it was, okay, this cool new tool, we can just use that, deploy it on this community that really doesn't have a
Right.
voice.
Can't fight back.
They're not gonna fight back, we're just
Yeah.
gonna do it.
Yeah.
So finally, now that it's coming for them, they're paying a lot more attention. And now what I hope happens in that is that they don't just think about what are the safeguards for white collar jobs and making sure that there isn't a bill proposed that protects those workers in just certain industries. Especially with the use of Gen AI, we cannot have any bills, any legislation focused specifically on Gen AI. It's got to be focused on AI in its totality. Because if we only focus on Gen AI, we're going to miss a lot of these other high-risk areas where we need oversight. So I'm hopeful, and I hope if any members of the California legislature or Congress are listening, that they take that to heart.
Good point. One of my favorite parts in my job is I get invited to a lot of law schools to guest lecture, and I've been trying to get the youngsters to see privacy law as like yesterday's patent law. If you've got any of this technical expertise, computer science degree for sure, and you can translate between engineers and the lawyers, like you can write your own paycheck, and all these regulatory frameworks that are popping up, are creating new jobs. In your space, are you seeing a volume increase in the number of students, moving into this frame?
Yes, absolutely. At the Goldman School of Public Policy, we've launched a tech policy initiative to really meet that demand coming from the students for more education. They want more courses. They want a certificate that will be on their transcript when they graduate, so that when they go back to the public sector, they go to the private sector, they have this tech policy training. So education, research opportunities, working with both the public and private sector, bringing in our faculty, staff, and students. And then the last is engagement with decision makers. So how can we take the immense knowledge coming from UC Berkeley and help both the public and private sector stakeholders make better decisions.
Great. Final question. I need you to talk me off a ledge. I guess it's like my philosophical, ideological discomfort with AI. I kind of say corporate practices in general, is that we're supposed to follow patterns. You notice, especially like in the law enforcement side, they look for the outliers, say, you're not fitting this pattern, probation, risk monitoring, sentencing. It looks like it's taking out the variety in humanity. And
Yes.
I get worried that it's pushing us. And I've seen in some of the deeper dives where it's gotten to education and housing discrimination via AI tools, where it's like, oh, your last name's Williams, that must be black, rejected. It's like it's pushing us to this middle conforming, vanilla, individual.
Yeah.
Are the tools to eliminate bias and all these other problems ever going to be able to overcome that? Or is that at its, I don't know if AI has a soul, but at its foundation,
AI does not have a soul.
AI definitely does not.
No.
Okay. Like, isn't that technology just kind of always going to have that same problem?
Yeah, guess what? I know you're gonna fall off the ledge now.
Okay.
All of statistics has already been doing that. Like, we have a bell curve of a
Right.
normal distribution,
Right.
right? And the edge cases are often ignored or they're flagged for something. Thinking about people with different abilities. like people with, hearing or vision, they're on the fringes, right? And oftentimes they don't fit into that bell curve. Whatever's developed, they're just sort of left to fend for themselves. So first, we're already there, I'm sorry. The second, the fact that we put people into categories, that we collect data points, and I say, I put you in these categories, that act of doing that is a bias, right? You might not perfectly fit into those categories, but it's the best that we could do. Maybe. I don't even know if I really agree with that.
Yeah.
Now, okay, I sound like such a cynic, but I also think, look, the tools can be used to allow us to be able to allocate resources more efficiently, effectively, and equitably. It's just about oversight and making sure that the data we collect is fit for purpose. It's using those privacy principles, only collect the data you need and use it in a way that you need to, and making sure there's human oversight. And there's one last point I want to make around this idea of bias in these models. There is no way you can eliminate all forms of bias in a model. It's impossible. NIST issued a report last year, or maybe it was the year before last, where they looked at different types of biases that are relevant for machine learning models. And they categorized them in 3 categories. One, implicit human bias, and under that there are different types. The second was institutional bias, which the United States is rife with. We were saying before too that some neighborhoods would be more likely to have a surveillance camera reading license plates than others. So zip code is often a proxy for historic discrimination. And then the third category is statistical bias. So just the model or the data, the decisions we're making, that can also lead to a bias. And under that, there are different types of biases. You cannot simultaneously address all of the sub-biases under those 3 categories. It's a give and a take. So first, if anybody ever interacts with a vendor who says our model is bias-free, we've tested for bias, they're full of it.
Kick them out.
Kick them out
Yeah.
and say, no, you can't be. Tell me seriously, how are you identifying and mitigating bias? Second, like I just said, it's really important about what bias matters. Is it on a protected characteristic of race, gender, religion? And then what steps have they taken to mitigate that bias and manage it?
Well, I'm glad we have smart people like you figuring that out, and then just come to me, tell me what law you need, and I'll go do that part. We'll mandate it. But I also want to give you,
Awesome.
don't tell the internet or my board of directors, the very first Secure Justice Coffee
The very
mug.
first one?
Number 1. I don't know, I was looking for a serial number, but I know it's number 1 because I just got it. It just got delivered to me.
Oh,
so,
thank you so
yeah,
much. That's
thank you.
awesome.
Yeah.
Great, thank you so much.
Yeah,
Thanks for
trying to
having
get our
me.
little swag store out, but thank you for your time.
My pleasure.
I am very grateful you're in this space doing this work. It's over my head on the technical side, but I love collaborating
Tune
with
into
you
Tech
folks.
Hype.
And
Well,
that's
we
what I
got
was gonna
you.
ask. Tech Hype, is it a regular schedule? Is it
Yeah.
whenever you see fit? What's it coming out?
Yeah, so Tech Hype has sort of 2 flavors to it. First, we have our shows where we sit down with experts to debunk the misunderstandings around emerging tech. Those are put onto YouTube, and then the audio is also redistributed through our podcast, and that's about bi-weekly that happens. Now, second, we also produce Tech Hype TLDRs, Too Long Didn't Read, where I analyze and summarize emerging tech laws, because I know most people don't like to do
Those have been
that.
great for me. I mean, that's what I'm, waiting in a meeting where I'm on Twitter. I'm like, oh, there's Brandie. She's got a new one.
I got, yeah. So we're gonna finish up the White House executive order on AI, and there are 8 priority actions. The last few videos are gonna be posted soon, and we are going to produce one on the EU AI Act, which is about 270 pages, so that one's coming soon.
That just got approved a couple days ago, I
Yep,
think?
unanimously.
Yeah.
Yep,
Wow.
this is a big thing, and it will affect the United States.
There's a lot of good work
I'll
going on.
cover
there.
it in the Tech Hype TLDR.
Great. Looking forward to it.
My pleasure, thank you so much for having me.
Thanks. Thank you for joining us. I'm sure we'll be updating this with additional AI conversations.